Hi viewers, this is an original story written by myself. I hope you all enjoy. The Ninth Titan. A Naruto and Percy Jackson fan fiction. Prologue, the one they don't sing about. The bards of Olympus tell many stories of the first war of Zeus hurling lightning from a mountain of clouds, of Poseidon splitting the earth with his trident, of Hades rising from the underworld with an army of the dead at his back. They sing of Cronus and his scythe, of Atlas and his punishment, of Prometheus and his fire. They do not sing of the fox. They do not sing of him because, as far as any god on Olympus knows, he did not survive the war. The last any of them saw of him, he was folding himself and the losing titans into a seal with his own body, a light closing over the pit like a wound closing over a blade. Zeus assumed the sealing killed him. Poseidon assumed the same. Even Hestia, who kept his memory longer than any of them, believed for 3,000 years that the fox who used to sit by her fire had spent himself entirely to shut that door, that whatever was left of him down there was echo, not a person. They mourned him, in the private, awkward way gods mourn things they never figured out how to thank. Then they did what gods do with debts they can't repay, they let him be forgotten, because forgetting was easier than admitting a titan had died protecting people who were never his to protect. Not one of them knows he is still down there. Not one of them knows he is still breathing. His name was Naruto. Chapter 1, Born of Chaos, Raised by Nothing. Not every titan was born of Auranos and Gaia. The first generation split the sky from the earth and populated the world with their children Cronus, Rhea, Oceanus, Themis, and the rest. But older than even they, buried in the folds of chaos itself, something else stirred. He was not made to rule. He was not made to be worshipped. He was made, if made is even the right word, the way a wildfire is made, or a flood, or a fox slipping between the roots of the world. Chaos did not shape him with purpose. He simply was, one day, curled up in the dark with 9 tails wrapped around himself like a question nobody had thought to ask yet. He did not remember waking up. He only remembered being alone, for what might have been a heartbeat or might have been 10,000 years, until Gaia's voice reached him through the bedrock, tired, ancient, achingly lonely in a way he recognized immediately. "You're awake," she'd said, not a question. "I think so," he'd answered, and that was the first thing he ever said. Gaia gave him a name, Kuabai, she called him at first, the 9-tailed one, but he told her, in the strange stubborn way he had even then, that he'd rather be called something a person would be called. Something with a story behind it, even if the story hadn't happened yet. Naruto, he decided. Maelstrom. Because he liked the idea of being something that pulled everything around it into motion, instead of something that just sat still and burned. Gaia laughed an earthquake in a dozen countries and let him keep it. Chapter 2, The War Nobody Wanted Him In. When Cronus rose against Auranos, Naruto did not fight. He was there, he was always somewhere near the roots of things, but war interested him less than the ache underneath it, the grief of a mother who could not stop hurting long enough to see what her children were becoming. When the Titans, in turn, warred against the Olympians, he stayed out of that too, at first. Let the children of Cronus fight the children of Cronus. It wasn't his quarrel. Then he watched a boy die. Not a god. Not a titan. A demigod, one of the first, born in the chaos of a war he never asked to be part of, cut down by a monster twice his height because nobody had thought to protect him. Naruto had felt something crack in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, not being a titan of gods and monsters, but of people, the small and unnoticed ones who got ground up in the wars of their betters. He went to Zeus first. The young king was arrogant, half mad with new power, but he was also desperate, and desperate men listen to anyone who offers a hand. "I'll fight," Naruto told him. "Not for you. For them." He gestured at the world below Olympus, the mortals, the demigods, the small gods with no thrones and no armies. "You protect what you rule." I'll protect what nobody else will. Zeus, to his eternal surprise, agreed. Dash. Chapter 3, Nine Tails Against the Sky. He fought like nothing Olympus had ever seen. Not with a scythe, not with lightning, not with the tools of gods, with something rawer. Where he ran, the ground rippled like water. Where his chakra, a word the Olympians didn't have and never fully understood, so they just called it the fox's fire, touched a titan's power, it didn't clash, it unwound it, thread by thread, the way a fox unravels a knot with patient teeth. He fought Hyperion to a standstill outside the walls of a city that doesn't exist anymore. He carried 3 wounded Olympians off a battlefield in one night, tails wrapped around them like a mother carrying kids by the scruff. He was not gentle, and he was not cruel, he was simply there, over and over, in the exact place someone needed him to be. The other titans hated him more than they hated the Olympians. A titan who chose the side of the small and the powerless wasn't just an enemy. He was an insult to everything they believed about strength. Cronus himself came to fight him once, near the end. Their battle lasted 3 days and flattened a mountain range into a plain. When it was over, neither had won, but Naruto was the one still standing, breathing hard, 9 tails torn and bleeding gold light, and Cronus was the one who retreated. You could have ruled beside me, Cronus told him, before he vanished into the war again. You're stronger than my own children. I don't want to rule anything, Naruto said. I just don't want anyone else to be alone in the dark. That's it? That's the whole reason. Cronus didn't understand. He never would. Dash. Chapter 4, The Seal. The war should have ended in victory. It nearly didn't. In the final days, as the Olympians pressed their advantage, Naruto felt something worse than losing, he felt the war refusing to end. Cronus, broken and furious, began gathering the surviving titans not to win anymore, but simply to make sure nothing survived if he didn't. Atlas was ready to bring the sky down on everyone's heads. Some among the defeated would rather unmake the world than kneel to it. Naruto understood, with the particular clarity that comes right before an impossible decision, that Zeus could win the war and still lose everything, that there would always be another titan, another grudge, another war 100 years down the line, unless someone closed the door for good. So he did the only thing a fox with 9 tails and no throne to protect could do. He gathered them. Not with chains, chains break, chains are for wars you're planning to keep fighting. He gathered them the way you gather something you love and can't save, with his own body. He wove his chakra around Tartarus itself, and around every titan still willing to burn the world down inside it, and he sealed the door from the inside, where no key would ever reach. Why? Rhea asked him, before the light closed over him for the last time. She was the only one who came to watch. You didn't have to. You already won. Naruto smiled at her, the same smile he'd give a stranger, easy and a little sad. Somebody has to sit with the ones nobody else wants to sit with, he said. Might as well be the guy who never wanted a throne anyway. You'll be alone. I was alone when I started, he said. I know how to do that. What I don't know how to do is let this happen again. The seal closed. Olympus rose out of the ashes of the war. And the world, slowly, began forgetting there had ever been a 9th titan at all. Dash. Chapter 5, What's Left Behind. Deep in Tartarus, in a pit blacker than the space between stars, 9 tails of fading gold light still curl around a prison of gods too dangerous to free, Cronus included, at least for a very long time, until fate finds its usual way of riding around any lock. He doesn't sleep. Titans don't, not really. He sits with his back against a wall that isn't a wall, in a place that isn't a place, and he listens to the world above him through the cracks in the pit, centuries of it, wars and heroes and prophecies, demigods born and demigods lost, the same stories rewriting themselves with new names. Sometimes he talks to the monsters chained near him, the ones reforming out of the dark after some hero's blade sends them back down. Most of them are too far gone with hatred to answer. A few aren't. Why do you stay? A young Draken once asked him, still soft-scaled, not yet twisted into cruelty by an eternity in the pit. The seal is yours. You could break it from the inside. Who'd stop you? Naruto looked up at the thin scar of light so far above them it might as well have been a memory of the sun. Somebody up there's still fighting my fight, he said. Some kid with a sword who doesn't know he's doing it. As long as that's true, I don't need to go anywhere. He doesn't know the name Percy Jackson yet. He doesn't know about a son of Poseidon who refuses a throne, who chooses his friends over godhood, who runs into Tartarus itself one day chasing someone he loves rather than leave her behind. But when that day comes when two teenagers fall further into the dark than anyone Naruto has felt in 3,000 years, choosing each other with a stubbornness he recognizes like an old scar. Something in the black pit opens one golden eye, and, for the first time since the world forgot his name, a fox titan starts to smile. Well, he murmurs, uncurling one tail toward the sound of two frightened, furious, impossibly loyal kids. Guess it's my turn to not let anyone be alone down here. Dash. Chapter 6, Too Small, Stupid, Stubborn Things. Tartarus does not have a floor so much as it has a bottom of an idea, a place where the ground is really just the pit agreeing, for the moment, to hold something up. It was on this not quite ground that Naruto felt them arrive, not heard, not saw, felt, the way you feel a splinter enter skin. 2 heartbeats. Mortal ones. Too fast, too fragile, too far down. He had felt plenty of things fall into Tartarus over 3,000 years, monsters reforming out of the dark, the occasional cursed object, once memorably an entire Roman legion's worth of ill luck compressed into a cursed eagle standard. He had never felt demigods. Demigods didn't come here. Demigods weren't supposed to survive the fall, let alone the landing. He unfolded himself from the knot wall he'd been sitting against for longer than some galaxies had existed, and for the first time in 3,000 years, Naruto Fox, Titan, jailer of a war nobody sang about, started walking. Dash. Percy Jackson's first thought upon hitting the floor of Tartarus, after several thoughts involving pain, was that the ground felt wrong in a new way, not just cursed evil pit wrong, but aware wrong, like it knew he was there and was deciding what to do about it. His second thought was Annabeth. Always Annabeth. He crawled to her before he'd even finished cataloging which of his own bones were still where they belonged. Hey, stay with me. I'm awake, she rasped, which was a lie, or at least an aspiration. Her ankle was bent in a direction ankles weren't built for. Blood matted her hair to her scalp. The Ares curse still burned somewhere behind Percy's ribs like a swallowed coal, and Annabeth's Akli curse sat on her like a second gravity, pulling her thoughts toward the worst versions of every memory she had. We fell into Tartarus, she said, staring up at the bruise-colored night sky. We actually fell into Tartarus. Yeah. Together. Yeah. She let out a laugh that had absolutely no humor in it and every ounce of love Percy had ever seen her carry. Okay, she said. Okay. We've survived worse. They had not, in fact, ever survived worse, and both of them knew it, and neither said so, because that was the deal they'd made a long time ago without ever discussing it out loud. They lied to each other exactly as much as necessary to keep walking. That was when the ground itself sighed. Dash. Percy had riptide out before the sound finished. Annabeth, despite the ankle, despite the curse eating her from the inside, had her knife in her offhand and her good leg under her, because that was who she was even at the actual bottom of the actual world. What rose out of the dark wasn't a monster. Monsters in Tartarus had a shape to them, a wrongness Percy had learned to read the way you learn to read weather. This didn't have that. This felt, weirdly, warm. Which was somehow more unsettling than anything else that had happened all night. 9 tails, faintly gold, unfurled from a form that mostly looked like a very tall, very tired man in orange and black, whisker marks etched into his cheeks like old scars that had never quite decided to fade. His eyes were the color of a color Percy didn't have a name for, not gold, not amber, something that looked like sunlight had been poured through the darkest part of the pit and hadn't been fully swallowed. "You too," the stranger said, and his voice had gravel in it, "and also, impossibly, kindness, are extremely far from where you're supposed to be." Annabeth's knife didn't waver. "Who are you?" "Name's Naruto." He crouched, slow, unthreatening, the nine tails settling around him like a cat curling its tail around its paws. "I'm gonna guess you've never heard of me." Which honestly, fair. I made sure of that, a long time ago. He tilted his head at them, and something in his expression shifted from worry to something that looked almost like grief. "You're demigods. You're not supposed to be breathing down here, let alone standing." "We fell," Percy said, because it seemed important to say something, and also because Riptide was still up and he was still doing math on whether 9 tails meant 9 times the problem. "Through the doors of death." Naruto went very still. "The doors," he repeated, "are open." Not on purpose," Annabeth said. "It's a long story. There's a war. Gaia's waking up, and..." "Gaia's what?" Naruto's tail snapped taut behind him, gold light flaring bright enough that Percy flinched. For one terrible second the kindness in his face was gone entirely, replaced by something old and enormous and furious, the face of something that had watched a war end once and clearly did not appreciate hearing it might not have stayed ended. Then, just as fast, he exhaled, and the light dimmed, and the exhaustion came back into his shoulders like a coat he'd put back on. "Of course she is," he muttered. "Of course. 3,000 years and the old lady still can't take a hint." He looked back at them, and now there was something almost apologetic in it. "Sorry. Didn't mean to loom. It's been a while since anyone's told me news." "How long is a while?" Annabeth asked, because even half dead at the bottom of Tartarus, she couldn't stop herself from wanting the exact data point. "Since the first Titan War." He said it like it was nothing, like it was a Tuesday. "I sealed the losing side down here myself. Cronus included, back before he got clever about hitching rides in other people's bodies." Annabeth went very quiet in a different way than before, the quiet of someone doing math she didn't like the answer to. "You knew about that? About him using someone?" "Not soon enough." Something in Naruto's face closed, briefly, the specific shame of a mistake he'd had 3,000 years to make peace with and never fully had. "The seal I built holds bodies. Titans, monsters, anything with a form solid enough to grab onto that stuff doesn't get past this door, not ever, not for anybody. What I didn't plan for was that Cronus wouldn't need a body to start over. Scattered essence, will, whatever you want to call the part of him that survived getting chopped into pieces, that's not a thing I could seal. It's more like smoke. It found its way up through cracks I didn't even know were there, patient, one whisper at a time, for centuries, until it found somebody topside desperate enough to listen." He shook his head, tails drooping slightly. "I've had a long time to be angry at myself about that. Somebody died because I built a door that only stopped the parts of the war I could see coming." "Luke," Percy said quietly. "He's talking about Luke." "I don't know the name," Naruto admitted. "I only felt it happened, the seal getting worked at from a direction I hadn't guarded, over years instead of all at once. By the time I understood what was leaking through, it had already found a mortal boy to whisper to. I couldn't reach up and stop it. All I could do was hold the door shut tighter and hope whoever was fighting him up there had it in them to finish it." His eyes found Percy's, something searching in them. "Did they?" "Yeah," Percy said, throat tight around the memory of Luke on the floor of Olympus, choosing, in the last seconds anyone would ever get to choose anything, to be more than what Cronus had made of him. He did. It cost him everything, but he did. Naruto nodded slowly, like something old and unresolved had just been given, finally, an ending. Then he's owed more thanks than I ever got, and I never even knew his name until right now. Add that to the list of things I owe this war. He exhaled, and the moment passed, tails settling back into their usual restless drape. Doesn't change what the seal's good for now, though. Bodies stay locked. That much, at least, I got right. Percy lowered Riptide about 2 inches, which for him was practically a white flag. You're a Titan. Technically I'm older than the Titans, Naruto said, with the specific weary pride of someone correcting a mistake he'd had to correct 1,000 times before anyone stopped making it. Chaos didn't make me to inherit anything or rule anybody. I just sort of showed up. Rest of the Titans never really forgave me for fighting for the little guys instead of joining the family business. Annabeth's eyes, even fever bright with the Akli curse, sharpened the way they always did in the presence of a mystery. There's no record of you. Anywhere. Not in Ovid, not in Hesiod, not in a single fragment. Yeah, Naruto said, and there was an old tiredness under the word. I asked for that. Didn't want statues. Didn't want a war named after me. I just wanted the fighting to stop, and it did, for a real long time, and that was enough. He looked at the two of them properly, then really looked, the way Percy imagined a doctor looks at a wound before deciding how bad it actually is. You two are dying, he said, flat, not unkind. Slow, but dying. What's eating you? Curses, Percy said. Long story. We're trying to reach the doors of death from this side, seal them from Gaia's people before they can use them. That's suicide. We know, Annabeth said. Naruto studied them for a long moment. 2 teenagers, bleeding, cursed, exhausted past the point most gods would have quit, standing in the worst place in the universe and still, talking about the mission instead of the pain. Something in his chest, a chest that hadn't ached like this in 3 millennia, cracked open a little, the exact same way it had the first time he'd watched a demigod die in a war that wasn't his to fight. Yeah, okay, he said, and stood, and the 9 tails settled behind him like a decision being made. Not doing this again. Doing what? Percy asked. Watching some kid get ground up in a war nobody built to protect them. Naruto rolled a shoulder, and gold light rippled down all 9 tails at once, chakra gathering like a held breath. I can't walk out of this pit, that's not on the table, not for you, not for anybody, not until the war I ended flares back up. But nobody said I had to sit still while I wait. Congratulations. You just gave 3,000 years of boredom something worth moving for. Dash. Chapter 7, What the Fox Remembers. They walked. Or rather, Percy and Annabeth walked, badly, leaning on each other, and Naruto walked beside them at a pace that somehow always matched exactly how fast they could actually go, never once making them feel small for how slow that was. So what are you? Percy finally asked, mostly to distract himself from the way the air itself seemed to actively resent his lungs. Titan. Fox. Guy with whisker marks. Pick a lane. Naruto huffed something that might have been a laugh in a kinder place. I picked a lane a long time ago. I'm whatever's left over when you take God and monster and throw out everything that made either of those words mean better than everyone else. He glanced sideways, and for a second the amber in his eyes looked almost fond. You remind me of someone. Kid I fought next to in the war. Different fight, different face, but same stupid refusal to let go of the people he cared about, even when letting go would have been so much easier. What happened to him? Annabeth asked, quiet, the way she asked questions she suspected she wouldn't like the answer to. Died protecting a city that forgot his name inside of 2 generations. Naruto's voice didn't change, but something underneath it did, the particular stillness of an old wound learning it still had feeling in it after all this time. That's the thing about this job. Protecting people doesn't come with a guarantee they'll remember you did it. Sometimes it doesn't even come with a guarantee they'll survive it. You do it anyway. Because the alternative is watching someone die because you decided your own comfort mattered more. Percy thought about Luke. About Bianca. About Silena, about Beckendorf, about a list that had gotten too long for a 17-year-old to be carrying and that he carried anyway, because apparently, according to a 3,000-year-old fox titan, that was just what the job cost. Does it get easier? He asked. Carrying the ones you lose. Naruto was quiet for 3 full steps. No, he said finally. But you get bigger than the weight. Eventually. If you let yourself keep caring about the next one instead of just guarding the grief from the last one. He looked at Percy, and then at Annabeth, and something in his face made it very clear he was not speaking in the abstract anymore. You two aren't gonna die down here. Not on my watch. I already lost that argument with the universe once, sealed myself in the dark so nobody else would have to lose it the way I did. I'm not losing it again because 2 kids decided saving the world was worth more than their own lungs. Chapter 8, The Fox's Fire. They found the first wave of Gaia's monsters an hour later, or what passed for an hour, in a place with no sun to measure it by. A knot of Dragons and Impauze, dozens strong, boiling up out of a fissure that led, Percy was fairly sure, exactly toward the doors of death. Stay behind me, Naruto said, and for the first time since they'd met him, his voice had the flat, immovable weight of something that had ended a war. We can fight, Percy started. I know you can. That's not the point. Naruto rolled his neck, and 9 tails spread out behind him like a hand of cards being fanned, each one lit gold at the tip. The point is, you've been fighting the whole way down here with nobody watching your back. Let somebody watch your back for 5 minutes. It's not a weakness. It's just, he glanced back, and something almost boyish flickered across 3,000 years of exhaustion. It's just what having backup feels like. You've earned 5 minutes of it. He went into the monsters like a maelstrom finally allowed to be what its name promised. Chakra unspooled off him in threads of burning gold that didn't so much strike the Dragons as unravel them, thread by thread, the way you'd pull apart a knot with more patience than the knot deserved. He wasn't cruel about it. Percy noticed that, even mid-battle, even exhausted and half delirious with pain, there wasn't hatred in the way Naruto fought. There was something closer to grief, like every monster he put down was one more thing he was sorry the world had made necessary. When it was over, the fissure was quiet, and Naruto stood in the middle of it with his tails drooping slightly, breathing hard for the first time since they'd met him. Out of practice, he admitted, catching Percy's stare. 3,000 years of sitting still does that to a guy. You didn't look out of practice, Annabeth said. She was staring at him now with the specific expression she got when a puzzle piece she'd been missing finally clicked into place. You held back a lot of that. Why? Naruto looked at her for a long moment, and something like respect moved behind his eyes. Because the last time I let myself go all the way, he said quietly, I ended a war by sealing myself in the dark for 3,000 years. I'd like to not have to do that again today, if it's all the same to you. Chapter 9, A Promise Older Than Olympus. They reached the edge of the chasm that led toward the doors of death as the night sky of Tartarus deepened from bruise purple to something closer to black. Percy could feel the mission's end close enough to taste, and could feel, with equal certainty, that neither he nor Annabeth had the strength left to survive whatever waited on the other side of that fissure. Naruto stopped at the edge with them, and something in the way he squared his shoulders told Percy this was the part of the walk they'd been building toward the whole time. I can't come through the doors with you, he said. Wherever they open, it opens on the mortal side, and I've got 3,000 years of unfinished business keeping a door shut on this side. If I leave this post, every titan I lock down here gets a straight shot back to your world, and I am not doing that to you after everything else today. Then what? Percy said, and hated how much his voice cracked on the word. Then I make sure you actually reach that fissure alive, and I hold everything behind you back long enough that nothing follows you through. Isn't there some way to just undo it? Percy asked. Now that we know. Now that the gods will know. Can't somebody just let you out? Naruto shook his head, slow, the gesture of a rule he'd made himself and could no longer unmake even if he wanted to. It's not a lock. Locks can be picked. This was a promise, made the same moment I made the seal. I bound myself to this pit exactly as tight as I bound Cronus and the rest of them. A promise like that doesn't break because somebody's grateful, or because somebody finally lit a fire for me on the surface. It only breaks the way it was built, at the edge of the war it was built to end. His tail settled low behind him, heavy with 3,000 years of knowing exactly how this worked. If the titans I'm holding down here ever get a real shot at rising again, if this thing with Gaia actually turns into a second titan war, the seal opens on its own, because the promise stops making sense the second the war starts fighting itself anyway. Until then, I stay exactly where I am. Doesn't matter who knows my name now. I don't get to leave just because it'd be nice to. That's not fair, Annabeth said, quiet and furious in the way she got when the universe broke one of her rules. No, Naruto agreed. It's not. It's just how the promise was built, and I'm the one who built it, so I don't get to complain about the terms. He crouched down to their eye level anyway, a strange thing for something so old and so large to do, and for a second the exhaustion in his face gave way to something warmer. You ask me if it gets easier, carrying the ones you lose. I told you no. I didn't tell you the rest of it. What's the rest of it? Annabeth asked. The rest of it is that you get to choose who you carry. Naruto's voice softened, and for a moment the whisker marks on his cheeks seemed less like scars and more like the marks of someone who had spent 3,000 years smiling at strangers just to remind himself he still could. I chose you too. Some ancient fox titan who sat in the dark for 3 millennia decided the two of you were worth breaking silence for. That's not nothing. Carry that with you, if it helps. Somebody down here believed in you enough to fight. Percy didn't trust his voice, so Annabeth spoke for both of them. Thank you, she said. For all of it? For not letting us do this alone. That's the whole job, Naruto said, standing, tails curling protectively behind him as the first distant howls of Gaia's remaining army rose out of the dark. Now go. Both of you. Live long enough to forget my name again, that's how I'll know you made it. Dash. Epilogue. The Ghost Who Was Never a Ghost. Percy Jackson and Annabeth Chase walked out of Tartarus through the doors of death, battered, cursed, barely standing, and very much alive, and behind them, in the dark, a nine-tailed fire held a line against an army so that two kids the world would never fully know the cost of could keep walking toward the surface. Camp Half-Blood received them the way camp always received its survivors, with too much noise, too many hands reaching to help, and a silence underneath all of it reserved for the things nobody had words for yet. It was 2 days before Percy could stand in front of the full Olympian Council without his knees threatening to give out, and it was there, in the throne room, giving his account of Tartarus to gods who had never once set foot in it, that he said the name. Naruto. The throne room went very, very quiet. Zeus's storm-gray eyes narrowed with the particular sharpness of a god who thought he'd misheard. Poseidon actually rose halfway out of his throne, coral crown forgotten, something raw crossing his face that Percy had genuinely never seen on his father before. Ares, for once in his immortal existence, had nothing sarcastic to say. And Hestia, small, quiet Hestia, tending her hearth fire in the corner of the room the way she always did during council, half forgotten the way she preferred it, went utterly still, her hands frozen over the flame. That's not possible, Zeus said, and for a king of the gods, he sounded remarkably like he was hoping to be told he was wrong. The seal cost him everything. We watched it cost him everything. He's alive, Annabeth said, steady despite the bandages, despite the curse still working its way out of her blood. He's been alive down there this whole time. 3,000 years. He's been the reason that door has stayed shut. We thought Poseidon started and stopped, and Percy watched his father, a god who did not, as a rule, run out of words, visibly run out of words. We built no shrine. We sang no song. We let him become a footnote because we assumed there was no one left to sing it to. He didn't want a shrine, Percy said, and found, to his own surprise, that his voice had an edge to it he didn't bother to soften. He told us that himself. He also told us nobody ever thanked him. I don't think he was expecting anybody to start. Hestia rose from beside her fire, an event so rare that even Ares turned to look and crossed the throne room floor in silence until she stood before Percy and Annabeth like the smallest and oldest thing in the room, which, in a way, she was. He sat with me sometimes, she said quietly, to no one and everyone, when the fire burned low and I didn't have the strength to keep it going myself. I always assumed the seal took that from both of us, him, and the fire he used to help me tend. I never let myself imagine he was still down there. It was easier to grieve him than to wonder if I'd simply left him. She looked toward the doors of the throne room, out toward the dark line of Half-Blood Hill and, far beyond it, the pit that held a dead Olympus had never known it owed. 3,000 years, she said, and not one of us thought to check. No one on the council had an answer for that. Not even Zeus. That night, for the first time in 3,000 years, a hearth fire was lit on Half-Blood Hill with a single, deliberate intention behind it, not for warmth, not for ritual, but as a message sent the only way a goddess of the hearth knew how, to send one straight down through solid rock to a place no prayer had ever reached before. We know now, the fire said, in the wordless language flame has always spoken. We're sorry it took this long. Zeus had asked, in the throne room, whether there was some rite, some sacrifice, some Olympian trick that could pry the seal open early now that they knew who it was costing. Hestia was the one who told him no. She had listened to Percy and Annabeth's account closely enough to understand the shape of the promise Naruto had made to himself 3,000 years ago, and she recognized it, in the way only a goddess of oaths kept quietly could. A promise like that didn't answer to gratitude. It answered to nothing except the exact war it was built to end. So the gods did the only thing left to do. They watched, and they waited, and for the first time in 3,000 years they did not let themselves forget again. Far below, at the edge of a chasm that had just closed on two children he'd chosen to fight for, a fox titan with 9 tired tails felt something warm brush against the freezing dark of Tartarus, small and stubborn and unmistakably a hearth fire, refusing, at last, to let him be forgotten. He didn't move from his post. He couldn't. Not yet. Not until the war he'd ended found its way to starting again, and the promise he'd made to a pit full of monsters finally let him go. But for the first time in 3,000 years, Naruto smiled like he meant it, and murmured to the dark around him. Took you all long enough to notice. Guess I'll just have to wait for the world to fall apart properly before I get to say hello. He settled back against the knot wall, tails curling around himself the way they had the very first day Gaia's voice found him in the dark, and went back to listening for footsteps, for war horns, for the sound of a promise finally coming due. Chapter 10, Cracks in the Promise. 7 months after the doors of death closed, Naruto felt something in the seal shift for the first time in 3,000 years. Not break. Not yet. But shift the way a dam shifts a season before the flood finally takes it, a groan deep in the stone that only the thing holding the dam together would ever notice. He pressed a hand flat against the knot wall of his prison and felt it, Gaia's will, pressing outward from 100 different directions at once, testing every seam of a seal she had never once, in 3,000 years, bothered to test before. She knows, he realized. She knows I'm the reason her old friends are still down here. And she's decided that's a problem worth solving personally. He'd assumed, when Percy and Annabeth had told him about the giants, that Gaia's war would stay her own new children for a new army, no need to go digging up the old ones she'd already lost once. He understood now how wrong that assumption had been. Giants alone hadn't been enough to fully wake her, and giants alone weren't going to be enough to win, and somewhere in her endless, patient, earthbound thinking, she'd arrived at the obvious solution: an army of titans, still furious, still undefeated in their own hearts, sealed away by a promise that had held for 3,000 years but had never actually been tested by something trying this hard to break it from the outside. The pressure came again, harder. Somewhere behind him, in the dark, Naruto heard something he hadn't heard since the war ended: Hyperion's voice, faint through the seal, almost gleeful. "She's coming for us, Fox. You held the door a long time. Long enough that you should have known nothing holds forever." Naruto didn't answer him. He'd learned 3,000 years ago that answering Hyperion only fed whatever was left of the old Titan's pride. Instead, he pressed both hands to the wall and pushed his own chakra back into the seam, gold light flaring bright enough to hurt, holding the promise together thread by fraying thread the same way he'd built it in the first place. It held. For now. But for the first time since he'd made it, Naruto understood, with the specific dread of someone watching a slow-moving certainty finally arrive, that the promise wasn't going to last much longer no matter what he did, and that when it broke, it wasn't going to break on his terms. Chapter 11, The War Comes Due. The break, when it finally came at Athens. Gaia's final push. The giants gathered, the Earth Mother herself stirring awake beneath the Acropolis, Cronus's old lieutenants thrown into the fight as monsters and worse had already stretched Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter past anything either camp had trained for. Percy and Annabeth were there, scarred in ways that didn't show and plenty that did, fighting alongside demigods they'd bled beside for 2 years now. The Olympians themselves had come down from their thrones for the first time in a generation, because a war that could wake Gaia fully was a war too large to fight from a mountain in the clouds. Nobody, not even the gods, felt it coming until the ground itself screamed. Gaia, in the last desperate hour of a battle she was losing, reached down through the bedrock of the world and tore not at Athens, not at the demigods, but at a seam 3,000 years old and half a world away, in a pit no living god had visited since the war that made it. She didn't care anymore whether the titans she freed would love her or resent her for the imprisonment. She only needed them angry and free, and pointed at Olympus. The seal shattered like a held breath finally let go. For one terrible heartbeat, Tartarus went silent, the silence of a held door swinging open, and then titans who had spent 3,000 years plotting exactly this moment began pouring up through the tier Gaia had made, furious, ancient, and unbound. And Naruto, who had spent 3,000 years dreading this exact sound, felt the promise that had defined his entire existence finally let him go. He didn't hesitate. There was no version of this moment where hesitating helped anyone. He gathered every scrap of chakra he'd been hoarding for 3 millennia, chakra that had never once been spent at full strength, because full strength had always meant risking the very seal he was trying to protect, and he moved, faster than a being that old had any right to move, straight up through the tier behind the fleeing titans, not to escape, but to make sure escape wasn't free. Chapter 12, The Fox Comes Home. The Battle of Athens had 1,000 terrible moments in it before that afternoon was through, but the demigods who survived it would spend the rest of their lives arguing about which one was the strangest. The instant the sky above the Acropolis split open in a column of gold light, and something enormous and nine-tailed came roaring out of the earth behind Hyperion like a hunting animal that had been waiting 3,000 years for exactly this chase. Percy felt it before he saw it, that same unmistakable warmth from Tartarus, except now it wasn't holding a line in the dark, it was furious, 3,000 years of patience arriving all at once like a wave finally allowed to break. "Naruto," he shouted, mostly on instinct, mostly because some part of him needed to be sure. The Fox Titan didn't answer him, not yet, too busy driving one enormous, chakra-wreathed hand into Hyperion's chest and folding the Titan of Light backward into the dirt like the war had never stopped for either of them. But Percy caught, even mid-battle, the flicker of amber eyes finding him across the battlefield, and something in them that looked almost like relief. He remembers me, Percy thought, absurdly, in the middle of a war. He actually remembers. On the Olympian side of the field, the effect was immediate and total. Zeus's lightning stuttered mid-cast. Poseidon, trident half-raised against a sea serpent giant, went stock-still, staring at the gold light pouring across the battlefield like a man seeing a ghost walk through a door he'd nailed shut himself. Ares actually laughed a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, and Apollo, of all the gods, was the one who said what everyone else was thinking too loudly to say out loud. He's huge. Why does nobody tell you these things? Hestia didn't say anything at all. She simply stopped tending the small ritual hearth fire she carried into every battle behind the front lines, and watched, hands pressed to her mouth, as the titan she'd mourned for 3,000 years fought like something that had never once stopped being furious on her behalf. Gaia's forces broke first. Not because the numbers had shifted, the numbers had been close before and would stay close after, but because morale is its own kind of weapon, and nothing breaks morale faster than watching your own general's oldest, angriest allies get driven back into the ground by the one titan who'd been strong enough to beat them the first time. Cronus' scattered essence, what little of him still lingered, unable to fully reform after Luke's sacrifice 2 years prior, fled the field entirely rather than face him. Even Gaia herself, vast and half-woken and barely more than a voice in the earth by that point in the war, went quiet in a way that felt, for the first time since the war began, like fear. Chapter 13, What the Fox Owed. When it was over, when the giants were routed and the last of the freed titans driven back into whatever corners of the world they'd scattered to, some captured, some fled, none of them anywhere near as dangerous loose as they'd have been united, Naruto stood in the wreckage of the Acropolis, breathing hard, nine tails scorched and smoking, and found himself facing, for the first time in 3,000 years, an entire throne room's worth of gods with absolutely nowhere to run to and no seal left to hide behind. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Zeus looked, for once in his very long life, uncertain how to start a conversation. It was Poseidon who moved first. The sea god crossed the broken marble in 3 strides and did something none of the assembled demigods had ever seen him do to anyone. He clasped Naruto's forearm, mortal to mortal, god to titan, the old gesture of soldiers who'd bled on the same side of a war. "We thought you died closing that door," Poseidon said, low, rough. "We built you no shrine because we thought there was nothing left to build one for. I am sorry. That is an insufficient thing to say to someone who spent 3,000 years alone in the dark on our behalf, but it is the true thing, so I am saying it." "Yeah, well." Naruto rolled a shoulder, wincing at a wound that would take weeks even for a titan to fully close. "You're forgiven, on one very firm condition." "Name it." "Don't build the shrine either." He looked past Poseidon, found Percy and Annabeth standing together near the edge of the ruined temple, both of them alive, both of them upright, both of them exactly as annoyingly stubborn as they'd been at the bottom of the world. Something in his chest, the same ache that had first cracked open watching a nameless demigod die 3,000 years ago, eased, just slightly, for the first time he could remember. "I didn't do any of this for statues. I did it because I don't like watching people who never asked for a war get ground up in one. That's it. That's the whole deal. If you want to thank me for something, thank me by not making me watch that happen again." Zeus, arriving last, looked at the titan who had fought beside him once and then vanished into legend for 3 millennia, and in the closest thing to humility the king of Olympus had managed in centuries, inclined his head. "The titans are scattered, not destroyed," Zeus said. "There will be work yet, hunting down what escaped today." "Yeah," Naruto agreed, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the smile that crossed his face had nothing exhausted in it at all. "Good thing I'm finally allowed to help with that part." Epilogue revisited, a promise kept, a debt repaid. Camp Half-Blood built no shrine to Naruto. He'd made that condition stick, loudly, the one time Chiron floated the idea. What they built instead, at his own quiet request, was smaller, a fire pit near the edge of the woods, tended by whoever needed somewhere warm to sit when a war left them with more grief than they knew what to do with, no ritual attached, no name carved anywhere near it. He visits it sometimes, when the fighting is done for the season and the scattered remnants of the old war have gone quiet enough to let him breathe. Hestia sits with him there, some nights, the two of them tending a fire that doesn't need tending, the way old friends do when the silence between them has finally stopped hurting. 3,000 years, she said to him once, watching the flames. I never forgave myself for not checking. You checked eventually, Naruto said. That's the part that counted. Nobody gets everything right the first time. You just gotta actually show up once you know better. Somewhere out past the edge of camp, past Half-Blood Hill, the world kept doing what it always did, throwing up new wars, new grudges, new gods and monsters and small unnoticed demigods who needed somebody in their corner. Naruto no longer had a seal to hold him back from any of it. For the first time in 3,000 years, when the Fox Titan heard a war starting somewhere in the world, he got to choose, freely, whether to go. He always chose to go. Chapter 14, Loose Ends. Freedom, it turned out, came with paperwork. Not literal paperwork, though. Annabeth had joked, exactly once, about whether Olympus kept a filing system for resurrected primordial beings, and gotten a laugh out of Naruto sharp enough that she'd filed the joke away to use again. But the practical, exhausting reality that ending a 3,000-year imprisonment didn't end a war. It just changed which battlefield he was fighting on. 6 titans had slipped through the tier Gaia had made before Naruto sealed it shut again from the outside, this time as a free agent rather than a prisoner, this time with the door reinforced by every god on Olympus lending their strength instead of one exhausted fox doing it alone. Hyperion had been driven back into the earth at Athens, weakened but not destroyed. Old titans didn't die easily, and everyone in that throne room had learned the hard way, 3,000 years apart, exactly how much punishment a titan of light could absorb before finally going down. The other 5 had scattered across the mortal world the way spilled mercury scatters across a floor, fast, silent, and very good at finding cracks to hide in. Zeus, in the aftermath, had offered Naruto a throne. Naruto had laughed so hard he'd nearly fallen off the Acropolis. I don't want a throne, he'd said, wiping his eyes, Ninetales twitching with the last of the laughter. I want a map. Point me at the ones who got loose. I'll handle it from there. So that became the shape of his new existence, not a god enshrined on a mountain, not a prisoner sealed in a pit, but something closer to what he'd always actually been underneath both of those labels, a maelstrom, moving through the world wherever the next mess needed cleaning up, this time by choice. Chapter 15, Crius in the Ice. The first one he found was Crius, Titan of the constellations, hiding in a research station in Antarctica that had gone dark 11 days before Naruto arrived, its 3-person crew missing, its equipment frozen mid-readout like the whole place had been paused rather than abandoned. Naruto found him in the station's old radio room, wearing the shape of a scientist who was very much no longer in there, muttering star charts to himself in a language that hadn't been spoken since before Rome existed. You, Crius said, when the frost-caked door blew inward. He didn't sound surprised. Titans rarely did, 3,000 years past the point where anything mortal or divine could genuinely surprise them. The jailer. Come to put me back in your pretty little box. Actually came to ask you a question first. Naruto stepped over the threshold, tail settling low and easy behind him, none of the coiled fury he'd brought to Athens. This wasn't that kind of fight, not yet. You've had a free shot at revenge for 2 months now. Instead you're up here counting stars in an ice cube. That's not what someone plotting a war does. That's what someone does when they don't actually want the war anymore and don't know how to say so. Something in Cryas's stolen face flickered, old pride warring with something that looked, for just a second, exhausted in exactly the way Naruto remembered being exhausted, 3,000 years deep in a pit with nothing but time to think about what he'd fought for and why. The stars don't care who wins wars, Cryas said finally, quiet. I used to think that made them beneath my attention. 3,000 years in the dark taught me otherwise. Naruto didn't drag him back to Tartarus that night. He sat with him instead, in a frozen radio room at the bottom of the world, and listened to a titan talk about constellations until the sun, such as it was, that far south, came up. In the morning, Cryas agreed to something no titan had agreed to in the entire history of the war: exile under watch, not imprisonment. A long leash instead of a locked door. Why, Cryas asked, as Naruto prepared to leave, would the jailer show mercy? Because somebody showed it to me, 3,000 years too late, and it still mattered when it finally came, Naruto said. Figured I'd try paying it forward before I decided everybody down here was a lost cause. Dash. Chapter 16, Not every ending is gentle. Not all of them were Cryas. Koyos, titan of intellect twisted bitter by 3,000 years of imprisonment and 2 months of freedom spent nursing every grudge he'd ever held, didn't want a conversation. He'd built himself a small cult in upstate New York within 6 weeks of escaping mortals who mistook his ancient, terrible cleverness for enlightenment, feeding him worship the way you'd feed kindling to a fire that had genuinely forgotten how to stop growing. That fight was short, and it was not gentle, and it ended with Koyos back in Tartarus in chains that Naruto made sure, personally, would hold this time not out of cruelty, but because some doors, once you'd looked through them properly, you understood needed to stay shut. Not everyone gets Cryas's ending, he told Percy afterward, the two of them sitting on the hood of a car outside a farmhouse that would need a great deal of mortal world explaining. Percy had come along on this one 17 now, steadier than the frightened, furious kid who'd stumbled out of Tartarus a year and a half earlier, though the scars from that fall, the ones that didn't show, hadn't gone anywhere. I spent 3,000 years hoping every single one of them had a Cryas in them somewhere, if I just waited long enough. Turns out hope's a real nice thing to carry into a fight, but it's not a strategy all on its own. Does it bother you? Percy asked. Putting him back. Every time, Naruto said, without hesitation, without drama, just a plain fact stated the way you'd state the weather. If it stopped bothering me, that's the day I'd stop being any good at this job. The bothering is the point, kid. It's how you know you're still doing it for the right reason. Dash. Chapter 17, The Last Dead. 5 Titans found, over 8 months 3 returned to the pit properly chained, 1 given the long leash Cryas had earned, 1 still, as of the telling of this story, unaccounted for, somewhere out in a world large enough to hide almost anything if it was patient about it. Naruto didn't mind the last one being loose. Not really. 3,000 years had taught him plenty of things, and one of the biggest was that a war doesn't actually end the day the last enemy falls. It ends slowly, unevenly, in 1,000 small decisions made by people who choose, every single day, to keep showing up for the parts of it that never make it into any hymn. He still visits the fire pit at Camp Half-Blood between hunts. He still sits with Hestia some nights, tending a flame that stopped needing tending a long time ago, just because the company's good and the silence has finally stopped aching. He still remembers a name nobody sang songs about for 3,000 years, mostly because he's the only one left who can, and because, these days, that's exactly the way he prefers it. Somebody has to sit with the ones nobody else wants to sit with. Somebody has to notice the small, unnoticed ones getting ground up in wars too big for them. He's not sealed in the dark anymore. He doesn't have to be, to keep doing it. That was always the whole point. Dash. Chapter 18, The One Who Waited. The 6th Titan had a name Naruto hadn't said out loud in 3,000 years, because saying it always cost him something: Iapetus. Father of Atlas, father of Prometheus, and in the tangled, complicated family trees Titans didn't like to talk about at dinner the one who'd fought Naruto the longest during the First War, and hated him for it the least. It took 11 months to find him, not because Iapetus was the cleverest of the six, but because he wasn't hiding at all. He was waiting, patient as stone, in the one place Naruto would eventually have to come looking on his own, the ruin of the mountain range their 3-day battle had flattened 3,000 years ago, now a quiet, half-forgotten valley in a corner of the world nobody had bothered naming twice. "You always did like to finish things where you started them," Naruto said, stepping into the valley at dusk, tails low, wary but not afraid. "I've had 3,000 years to think about how our fight should have ended," Iapetus said. He hadn't taken a mortal shape at all. He sat at the valley's center in his true, ancient form, weathered like the stone around him, patient as erosion. "You beat me, Fox. Not because you were stronger. Because you were fighting for something and I was only fighting against something. That's a harder kind of strong to match. You could have come at me 100 times easier than making me hike out here. I didn't want easier." Iapetus finally looked up, and something in his ancient, weathered face was closer to peace than Naruto had braced for. "I wanted to ask you something, and I wanted to ask it somewhere it would actually mean something. Was it worth it? 3,000 years alone in the dark, for a species that forgot your name before your body was even cold. Was it worth it?" Naruto thought about a nameless demigod, dead in a war he'd never asked to fight. He thought about Percy and Annabeth, bleeding and stubborn at the bottom of the world, refusing to let go of each other even there. He thought about Hestia's fire, warm against 3,000 years of frozen dark. He thought about Cryas, forgiven, and Koyos, not, and the difference between the two, and how both of those outcomes had still, somehow, been worth reaching for. "Yeah," he said, simply. "It was worth it. Every second." Iapetus was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his weathered head, not in surrender, exactly. In something closer to acknowledgement, one old soldier to another, the kind of gesture that doesn't need chains to mean something. "Then I won't make you drag me back," he said. "I'll walk in on my own. Let that be worth something too." Chapter 19, What Gets Sung. The sixth Titan returned to Tartarus of his own free will, escorted by the fox who'd once ended a war by sealing himself in alongside him. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't tragedy either. It was just an ending, the quiet, unglamorous kind that doesn't get a hymn written about it, which suited both of them fine. Zeus offered, one final time, to build Naruto a shrine on Olympus. Naruto turned it down, one final time, and this time the king of the gods didn't argue. He'd learned, over 11 months, that some debts are better honored by leaving someone alone to be exactly who they'd always chosen to be than by trying to enshrine them into something they never wanted to become. What Olympus built instead, quietly, without ceremony, at Hestia's insistence and no one else's, was smaller than a shrine and, in its own way, larger. A standing invitation. A seat, always open, at the edge of every Olympian council from then on, whether Naruto chose to fill it or not. Most sessions, he didn't. He was usually somewhere else in the world by then, checking in on a demigod having a bad week, or sitting with a monster 3 days out of reforming who hadn't yet decided whether the dark had to make them cruel. But the seat stayed open, and everyone in that throne room understood exactly what it meant that it did. Percy Jackson grew up. Annabeth Chase grew up. They built the lives they'd nearly died a dozen times over to earn the right to build, and on quiet evenings at Camp Half-Blood, when the campfire burned a little brighter than the wood alone should allow, they'd sometimes catch a flicker of amber in the flames and know, without needing to ask, that somewhere out in the world, the fox who'd found them at the bottom of everything was still doing exactly what he'd always done, showing up for the ones nobody else thought to look for. Final chapter, The Maelstrom's Choice. 3,000 years is a long time to spend deciding what you're willing to become for the sake of people who might never know your name. Naruto had made that choice once, in the dying hours of a war that should have broken him, and had spent every century since finding out exactly what that choice cost and whether he'd make it again if given the chance. He would. He always would. Not because he owed the gods anything, he'd stopped keeping that ledger the day Poseidon clasped his arm on the ruins of the Acropolis and finally said the word sorry like he meant it. Not because history would remember him, for history, as history does, would likely forget his name again within a few centuries, and he'd made his peace with that a long time before Percy Jackson was ever born. He did it because somewhere, always, there was a small unnoticed thing getting ground up in a war too large for it, and because once, a very long time ago, in a valley now flattened into a memory, he'd decided that was worth fighting for, even when nobody was watching, even when nobody would ever say thank you, even when the only reward for the fight was the fight being won. The pit is quiet now. 5 titans sit inside it, one walking free on a long leash he's slowly learning not to strain against. Somewhere out past the edge of the world, a maelstrom moves from war to war, city to city, quiet grief to quiet grief, choosing freely, every single time to show up anyway. No hymn was ever written for him. He never once asked for one. That, in the end, was always the whole point. Dash. The end. Thank you for reading the 9th Titan and Naruto x Percy Jackson crossover. It's been a pleasure building this world with you.